Heavenly Father, thank Thee for the Sabbath day and for Hodge's discussion of it and for our pondering of the meaning of the institution and our obligations and privileges in it. Guide us in our discussion tonight and help us from the heart to reverence Thee and Thee alone, and in the way in which Thou wouldst be worshipped and in the day that Thou wouldst be worshipped. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. That little note is just for those of you who are in the Calvin class that I realized we had forgotten the fact we only have 3 Mondays in May, and so I'm skipping this chapter, partly because we're dealing with prayer and Hodge's treatment later on. We're going directly tomorrow morning to the election discussion of the institutes. And then with respect to this class, I would like to make one change also, and that is next week. The section I was particularly concerned about, I thought we might have caught up in what we had signed, is really in the infant baptism discussion. And it's a very significant seeming difference between Charles Hodge and the Puritans, and specifically Jonathan Edwards. And I'm not at all sure, even after rereading this for about the 4th or 5th time, that there is this difference. There's a point at which Hodge feels he's definitely different from Jonathan Edwards, and there is a verbal difference at one point, but at any rate, I think we ought to study that. So may I request for the Hodge class next week, next Sunday night, 7 o'clock, take the infant baptism chapters, at least the pages beginning 547 following, that area. The whole chapter is extremely important, but that section will give the basic reason for infant circumcision in the Old Testament and its parallel with infant baptism in the New Testament, and then he gets into the question of what infants are to be admitted to baptism, and that's where there's significant difference between Puritan Congregationalism and Presbyterianism in the Middle Colonies came into expression, and it has quite a significant bearing today, and it also has a bearing on our next topic, which is the Lord's Supper. So next Sunday night, May the 4th, infant baptism discussion beginning 547, page 547 in this volume, and then the following Sunday we take up the Lord's Supper, and the 3rd Sunday in May, the Christian after death, and then we close the 25th of May with the Second Coming. The only real change there is the prayer is discussed in connection with the Lord's Supper, isn't it? How does that chapter division read? I don't want to eliminate that. It's in the yeah. Actually, that's what the story is. Especially since we are eliminating the section for those of you in the Calvin class, let's try to get that. Look for a moment at the table of contents, if you will, on under the Lord's Supper, and see what we have there. This is scheduled for us the 2nd Sunday in May, and it starts on page 611. It would run for over 100 pages if you took both. Let's see if we can be somewhat more selective there. I think most of you have a general understanding of the doctrine of the Reformed churches, Zwingli and Calvin, and the discussion of the Lutheran doctrine of the Church of Rome. So let's say we'll take both sections, but I will concentrate on prayer. Let's be arbitrary and say the first hour will deal with the Lord's Supper generally. You have much more acquaintance with that. I'm sure you have more experience with prayer, but at the same time you may never have made a heavy study of prayer such as he gives. So we'll just be arbitrary. Next Sunday night we'll spend the first hour largely with your questions, because if I try even to summarize, you won't get any time for your own development. And I'm sure you have ideas about this if you can scan the chapter somewhat before, and then we'll look more particularly the second hour at the doctrine of prayer, and then the rest of the course is stated there. Now, this evening, it's a matter of the fourth commandment on page 321. Again, largely a question of what questions you have. He starts out with its design, to commemorate the creation, and page 321, and page at the bottom of that, to preserve alive the knowledge of the living God. Item number 3, the command was designed to arrest the current of the outward life of the people. 4, it was intended to afford time for instruction. And 5, by the prohibition of servile labor, whether man or beast, designed to secure recuperative rest. 6 is a day of rest and is set apart for intercourse with God. It was designed to be a type of that rest which remains for the people of God, as we learn from Psalm 95 and the Hebrews. And 7, as the observance of the Sabbath had died out among the nations, it was solemnly reenacted under the Mosaic dispensation. It's remember the Sabbath and so on. Any question about those fundamental purposes in the Sabbath day that he states very briefly there? Very important, because it's a fundamental notion, and whatever questions we may have about the relationship between the Old Testament Sabbath and the New Testament Sabbath in which we live, none of this changes. Certainly this is a part of the basic meaning, even if one feels that it doesn't apply to a 24-hour Saturday from sunset to sunset. It still would have these fundamental purposes in view. I don't think there's ever been any serious debate on that point. The debate comes more with with some other connected questions which he mentions there. Yes, Bob, please.
I have a question that probably isn't appropriate at this point as some other. I'm under the general impression, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that at the time of Jonathan Edwards' pastorate, that era of the Puritan approach to things,
18th century,
put rather more emphasis on the instructional aspects of the Sabbath. That they spent almost the entire Sabbath in instruction and public worship and that kind of thing. Is that right?
They put a great deal more stress on instruction across the board in those days than we do now, and a great deal of it was done in the Sabbath, and the services were longer, and usually, as in Edwards' congregation, he would devote the Sabbath afternoon to instructing the children, usually. So much of his time, and remember the Sabbath would start on sunset Saturday, and worship service would be on Sunday morning, and it would be a full service. I mentioned in St. Louis the other day that I once read Edwards' sermon, a farewell sermon, at his deliberate speed, not my type of speech, but his solemn, slow, gestureless. People ask the question whether he was an eloquent person. It depends on what you mean by eloquence. As far as the content, yes. Style, no. But I try to read it slowly and deliberately, the way I imagined Edwards would read it, and it'd take an hour and a half, you see. Now, he may have taken an hour and a quarter, but the sermons would be that, and then there'd be a very full prayer as well. The service as a whole would be at least 2 hours, you see there. And then if they had something for the children in the afternoon, then they had their midweek Thursday night lecture. That was a real meaty type of presentation. Would run for a couple hours and very solid. I mean, the sermons, as I say, my students at the seminar would cry uncle about the sermon. And the midweek sermon lecture, like, for example, I think I mentioned to you once when we were talking about the arguments for God, his dissertation on Romans 1:20 on a Thursday night. It must have run over a couple hours. It was almost a full outline of apologetics. It may have gone over more than one Thursday night. We're not sure about that. Very close-grained reasoning. These farmers would sit there and presumably get it. My seminary students would be overwhelmed by it. They were the greater farmers in those days, or inferior seminary students today, one or the other. Yes, please.
I'm just dying to know, did the little children sit with their families through those?
Yeah, this new book of Patricia Tracy on Jonathan Edwards' pastor. I don't have my stuff with me, but it has a diagram of the seating arrangement according to income and prestige and all sorts of things in the families and all that type of thing. And the children, of course, were accustomed to behave too, but their main problem was with the adults falling asleep and so on. Jonathan Edwards' father, a pastor in East Windsor, Connecticut for many years, his whole life. As a matter of fact, that was a very common Puritan pattern. Usually if a Puritan pastor left the church, you knew some crisis had developed. They were dismissed, as in the case of Jonathan Edwards himself and so on. But he'd constantly be complaining about people sleeping. These farmers, work very hard to come in these sermons. I tell you, you either had to be fascinated with them or you would go to sleep very easily because they didn't tell you any anecdotes, nothing to liven up or anything like that. So he was a livelier preacher. A congregation in Connecticut was asked once about the difference between Timothy Edwards and his son Jonathan. Timothy was more lively. Jonathan was more profound. They even recognized it in those days. But that would be the problem. And yeah, I know full well, a man have to be alive in Christ to follow the gospel. Well, I get excited by it. I've never read a dull sermon of Jonathan Edwards. I've never read a sermon that hasn't moved me deeply and so on. But then I'm a professional theologian. I love the Bible, and I love the close-grained thinking and all the rest of it. But I know not every farmer is quite as excited about theology as I am, and so on. But at the same time, when people ask me, did he go over their heads and so on, their complaint was that he didn't go over their heads. They understood him all too well and so on, what he was saying. But some of the fine points they may have gotten away with and gotten away from him and so on. But they definitely did put heavy instruction on the catechism, the Westminster Catechism, you see, with the standard of Congregationalism. The only point where they differed with the Westminster Standard was on the church polity. And even there, Stoddard and Edwards were more in favor of the Presbyterian system and were moving steadily that way. And in a certain sense, when Edwards accepted his dismissal at the recommendation of a committee the committee had no authority as a presbytery. A presbytery could remove Frank Pick from this church, you see, and so on. But no congregational advisory body has an authority to remove a pastor. But he submitted himself voluntarily to that, and when his vote was won against him, there was a close vote, 10-9 or something like that, and won again. And one of his own advocates and so on was hampered from getting there. Otherwise, it would have been an absolute tie on the vote. But he'd had no obligation to leave under that. But once he agreed to it, then he did, of course. But that was, again, a kind of respect for the Presbyterian authoritarian pattern that Stoddard himself strongly advocated. And when Edwards was dismissed, the Scottish church would love to have had him. They wanted him to come. He just didn't feel he could make that trip with 11 children and all that sort of thing, and he didn't go. But as far as a system of doctrine, as far as the order is concerned, but even the Presbyterians in those days, they were much stricter in the observance of the Sabbath. You can tell from this and the catechetical instruction of the... But it was one of the interesting things about the catechetical instruction that this Archibald Alexander, who was a Presbyterian pastor who was the first president of the Princeton Seminary in 1812 when it was founded, was a strong proponent of the Sunday school movement. You see, the Sunday school movement was generally an alien thing for people who trained their children in the catechism. It started under Robert Raich in England, I think you know, for the strays, the kids who wandered around the streets of London and weren't being taken care of religiously. Raich gathered them in, and the so-called Sunday school movement. These children weren't they weren't church children. They weren't used to being trained in the catechism and so on. But when the church was doing her job in the old-fashioned way, heavy emphasis on the education. The children knew the catechism. That's part of the reason those farmers could handle sermons like this. You master that Westminster Catechism, and a person like Edwards, he would insist on the rote memory, but he was far more insistent on the understanding of what was memorized and not satisfied with a mere recitation. I was given a little demonstration in the South once of one of our Christian schools down there, and the pastor was rather proud. He bring me in, he said, let me put on a show for you. And he'd ask these questions where the answers came like that, and they had the commas even in place, and all that type of very impressive. But when I started to quiz the kids on the meaning of it, boy, did he get it read, they were mastering it all right. And, when I taught the catechism, I didn't take no nonsense on that either. That was the first thing that had to be settled. There, you'd say 10 or 15 minutes, we'd cross-examine. And then for the rest of the hour, the meaning of the thing, we work it over so they get to be young theologians in those days. But this is where, as you can sense in Hodge, those of you who've read this realize that instructional aspect of the Sabbath, very, very important to them. And yes, it was definitely developed a good deal more. Much more time was taken on it in those days.
I wanted to follow up to that because I kind of thought you were going to say what you did.
Yeah, now comes the real question. Huh?
Yeah, well, based on that, is it fair to say that we can see a decline in that aspect even in Hodge from Edwards' day, I think, and from certainly from Hodge's day to now, as far as
it's a vast
the
change,
church's position or its activities itself, is a huge difference.
I don't know how much difference there is between Hodge and Edwards on that, though. Edwards died in 1758, and Hodge died about a century later. Hodge spans, 1825 roughly to 75, the middle of the last century. So he's a full century after Edwards, mostly, and all. But they were still, his children were well-trained. Presbyterians were well-trained. And as I say, you can tell from this passage how important it was for instructional purposes to have that Sabbath day. But there had not been that much let up in the Presbyterian and Congregational churches in that day. Somebody asked in this class, I think a year ago, when did I think it was Randy. Randy, didn't you ask a question like that? When did this big change come over? Somebody asked the question, I don't know. And I can see the perplexity on your face suggests you weren't the one who raised it. But somebody asked the question. I was pointing out that Nichols, in his History of Christianity from 1650 to 1950, points out that around 1890, the big waves of European liberalism washed ashore over here. We felt the real impact. Darwin wrote his Origin of Species, remember, in 1859, roughly 60, but it was about 30 years after that the real impact of liberalism came along. See, after Hodge had departed from the scene, Shedd, who was the Hodge of his day at the turn of the century, he was the one who got the real drive. Well, you can sense it in too, but that's when the change started, around the turn of this in a big way. And now we're almost decadent. It's really, now the difference between us and Hodge a century before is catastrophic. The difference between Hodge and Edwards and the training of the time was more microscopic. I wouldn't say microscopic, but certainly not catastrophic. But the difference there, you no doubt. Yeah, Randy?
Just one thing. I grew up in Homeland, and the greatest shock I ever had was when I finally got to the Midwest to start teaching and found out there were adult Sunday school classes.
Yeah, you've heard me talk about that glacial age from New England moving right down relentlessly but slowly through the middle west and right down into the southwest and so. But you can tell the tone of it. I can tell it here in Wichita. The difference between this. When Ed and I get back to New Haven, even though I'm buried in the books and we don't have much connections up there, personal, it's academic pretty clearly. But you can almost feel the difference. Randy?
Do you have any opinion on how similar the culture would be now compared to when it was the fall of the Roman Empire when they went into Carthage?
You mean as far as the Christianity was concerned?
Christianity is concerned in terms of the basic...
Vaguely. At that time, of course, we were a rearguard action. The Roman Empire was basically a pagan thing, was being invaded by pagan barbarians and so on. But Christianity was organized enough to survive that, and that's when the Roman concentration, papal power, came into realization because it centralized in the imperial city of Rome, and some of those early popes like Gregory were very powerful and figures and so on. But it was still a minimal movement. But once the Roman Empire, which was not only the dominant political force, but it was also the vehicle of culture as well, was beginning to collapse and so on. Then, of course, the church emerged as a center of culture and the subjugation, to a degree, the evangelization of these barbarians. But you see, you were just trying to preserve a Christian witness as over against a well-established witness such as we had in this country here, and reaching a kind of apogee in the 18th century and steady decline from that particular time. It was perhaps a rather sudden drop around 1890 and so on. And today we're fighting for the preservation of the Christian religion. It's that serious. Yeah, today, yeah. But I would say in reference to your question was the magnificent thing, say, about the 5th century was the fact that Christianity was enough organized and presenting enough of core Christian doctrine to survive where Rome herself collapsed. and to give us a vehicle for the preservation of culture and also the propagation of the Christian religion. Even though it was very simplistic, partly because of the fact that these people couldn't read or write, and the images and so on were called the Bibles of the illiterate, and Rome was cultivating that because, but I won't go into it, but you get the basic type of difference. But this Muggeridge keeps talking about the invasion of the barbarians, and a new barbarian age, and one reason he's gone into Romanism is the fact that he thinks that Romanism, in spite of all her faults and all, has nevertheless survived. He sees it that way, as if that were Roman Catholicism back in those days. And most people have been fed that so long, they think that even knowledgeable people like Muggeridge and all, that nevertheless, the very fact that it has survived, and we're in another barbarian age when Christian culture is just about to disappear, and so on. So he returns, doesn't return, I don't think he was ever connected with it, but he becomes a Roman Catholic in his later years. He's about 80 years of age now, you know. So. But if there's no further question about the fundamental rationale for a Sabbath day, I may say, by the way, that those of you who have the two Edwards volumes, he has a triple sermon on the Sabbath day, its nature and its perpetuity, to show that it continues, but that it was changed from Saturday to Sunday. And honestly, it makes this look like amateur reading. It is so much superior to this treatment of Hodge. There's really no comparison, except that Hodge is superior in giving a wider historical survey and all. It's, after all, in a technical theological book. But I would suggest that you read that along with this, and let Hodge supplement it in any way. But for the basic case for biblical Sabbath and the case and the type of position Hodge is advocating here, they're together on it. It's essentially the same position, but his rationale, his biblical command, and so on is a great deal superior to this presentation of Hodge, which I would consider very good. This is not his strongest chapter in the commandments, but it's a good one. But those of you who are interested in the communist question and the social question of our time, you do very well to read his chapter on the 8th commandment, private property, thou shalt not steal. That's one of his best handling. His handling of the 2nd commandment about idols is also outstanding. I think of his handling of the 10 commandments, this may be the least impressive. It's a good, I'm not suggesting it's not a good chapter, it's a good chapter, but it's, I think it's surpassed by his handling of the others, especially the 8th and the 2nd, but we're very brief on the last one, thou shalt not covet. He reminds me of that statement, you know, that I mentioned to you once about a priest saying, I've had all sorts of sins confessed to me, except no one has ever confessed the sin of coveting. It's an interesting thing. See, that's the wrap-up commandment of them all. But that's a sin so subtle that what this priest, I think, was inferring is that most people are unaware. Not, he didn't think that his people were totally free of covetousness because they hadn't confessed it. I think he was aware of the fact that they were just not sensitive to that. We know if we hit somebody who lost our temper or violated the 6th commandment or something like that, or put our hands in somebody's pocket and taken money, we're a thief and so on. But covetousness sneaks up on you so subtly and so unobservantly that you're hardly even aware of it. It's rather interesting that Hodge deals with it briefly, but he deals with it briefly because it has to do with the spirit of the thing rather than a specific commandment. On page 323, the Sabbath was instituted from the beginning and is a perpetual obligation. There's no question on that. As I say, the only question is whether that perpetual obligation pertains to a 24-hour observance and it's sunset to sunset from Friday night to Saturday night, you know, that type of thing. But that it's a perpetual obligation for the Sabbath commandment, no question in Hodge's mind, no question really in anybody's mind. The questions come in more with the actual details of how it's to be observed and how long and what day. I think you all know that the Seventh-day Adventists, the Seventh-day Baptists, and so on are strong champions of the immovability of the very day, and all. Others, on the other hand, have removed any 24-hour period aspect to it, whether Saturday or Sunday. Nevertheless, it's primarily for worship. And as I remind you, even Luther and Calvin took what we call the continental Sabbath as over against the Puritan Sabbath. It's gotten to be referred to that way. You don't usually refer to Hodge as a Puritan. There, would be basically in agreement with him. You'll see next week an area of significant difference, but basically he's the same. But and he's advocating what's called a Puritan. He's not thought of as a Puritan especially, but he's advocating what's called a Puritan Sabbath, and he's breaking with his Calvin at this particular point. He doesn't mention it, but Calvin's much looser on the observance of the Sabbath. He agrees on it being Sunday and all that. So on this point here, that it was instituted from the beginning and as a perpetual obligation, there's hardly any debate on that subject. The debate comes more with the aspects connected with the Sabbath.
What's the continental Sabbath?
That's a way of referring to the two different views of it. That some people, you can tell which view they hold when they say the looser view and so on. But this is a view of the Roman Church. It's a view of the Lutheran Church. It's a view of the Reformed Church on the continent as well. That worship is the one continuing obligation of the Sabbath day, then hour or 2 hour, whatever it is, but that is so. But the rest of the commandment, the 24-hour period, the Saturday aspect of it, the prohibition of recreation or anything like that, Calvin would like to bowl on the Sabbath, and Luther was very strong against the Puritan Sabbath. It hadn't developed very much in those days. Through the Middle Ages, had gotten away from it, and Puritanism comes a little bit later. Can't define its actual beginnings, but Luther was not influenced by this type of movement. He went along with the rather lax. I'm trying not to use prejudicial terms there, but lax. These people don't think it's lax. These people think we who hold the Puritan Sabbath idea are excessively strict in this matter. But the Puritan Sabbath is the change to Sunday, but the observance of it in the way in which Hodge has it here. That would be what we call the Puritan Sabbath. I think, even though he's not thought of primarily as a Puritan, it nevertheless is the Puritan Sabbath. But we'd say a 24-hour observance is over against a 1-hour observance. They agree on the fact there ought to be public worship, and it should be necessary to attend public. They'd be fined in Geneva for not being in church on Sunday, and they would be fined in New England for it also. I mean, where you had a kind of liaison with the state, a church-state liaison, a theocracy, you see, it was a violation of the law of the whole community not to pay your church dues and things of that character. You could be disciplined for things of that character. But fundamentally, the continental Sabbath, which is overwhelmingly the majority opinion, even historically, there. The reason we're so shocked in our tradition, where you find me so unhappy about the matter, is that this is a part of our tradition. I happen to think it's right as well, but it's also part of our tradition. I'm very much distressed with what Rome is doing to it, what Lutheranism is doing to it, but my eyebrows don't go up as far because they never have accepted that as a sound interpretation of it. Well, I think they're mistaken. They're at least consistent with what they think is right. And we, on the other hand, have taken this view. And when you find a man like Hodge saying it, you know, this is a standard of Reformed orthodoxy in the 19th century. 20th century, it's absolutely gone by the board. There's hardly any minister today who believes in it and observes it. And you don't have a Sunday service here at Eastminster because there wouldn't be any more than a handful of people out. That's all there is to simply. Remember where we have 1,500 members here or something? We'd have about 15, but we'd have it here. This is the people, part of your people. I don't know how many of you are coming because it's the Sabbath day or not. You may just be wanting to study theology. I don't know. But at any rate, I'm sure that typical service wouldn't have very many. You know what it is in Wichita. There are very few evenings in Pittsburgh the same way. You can hardly find an evening service in Pittsburgh. Too, Edna? I saw Edna's hands first. I'm not just showing a little. There's no nepotism here, okay? Some do, yeah, some do. Yeah. Yeah. They got it largely from the Yeah. Tell him a little bit about Urk. You see, our son studied in Urk in the Netherlands on his doctor's degree a couple years ago, and he had spent a whole year there. And Edna visited him on occasion. about the way they observe the whole day in Urk. URK is the name of this little village in northern. Very strict. Oh no, you know Amsterdam, and yeah, but Utrecht and the other places. It's only in a small village like that where the conservatives sort of tend to concentrate, and they have a tradition there, and they observe it. Hey, those of you who know Ocean Grove in New Jersey, the Methodist Center, you can't, unless it's changed there, you can't drive a car in there on a Sabbath Sunday, can you? No. Has it changed?
Yeah, just in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yes, I knew it had to be within the decade because the last time I was there, we parked our car out and we walked in there. That's a Methodist center, of course, and the Westview is pretty strict on those matters. They had a real development of it, but it's true. What Edna's observing here is that there are parts of the continent where they do share this view, and people like Futsius, who's sometimes called a pope of the Netherlands in the 17th century, he was strongly influenced by English Puritanism. So in a certain sense, it's back in those days, the influence would go from Britain to the continent. After that, from the continent to Britain, and then over to, we used to say it would take about 20 years for a new intellectual development to cross the Channel, and another 20 years to cross the Atlantic Ocean to the United States, and we would always be roughly about 40 years behind certain developments, whether they were good or bad developments. But at this particular period, and really up until the 19th century, the ideas seemed to gel most in Britain, and then they'd cross over into Europe, and Perkins and people like that were very powerful in their influence on the continent, and they reached people like Futsius, who was a Dutch theologian of great power in the 17th century, and he was a strict Sabbatarian, but he had a major battle on his hand with other Dutch Calvinists who would take the typical continental view. Dale?
I'm not sure I can formulate this question. I want to get back to Calvin's bowling on the Sabbath.
You like that, huh?
Yeah.
Hey, if I may inject one word, I was talking to when I gave my lectures here the first or second year about that, I'd point out that so these people would know that though Jonathan Edwards and I were for it, John Calvin and Martin Luther were against it, and so on, so that if they did prefer that, they were in very honorable company. But the thing I warned them about is this. You don't say because you are given over to the continental Sabbath, boy, I like Calvin's view, and so on. Calvin wouldn't appreciate that. If you read the scripture and come to the same conclusion he did, that would be fine. But if you just want to have a lax Sabbath observance, and you find you therefore arbitrarily choose Calvin, and so on, he wouldn't appreciate that. That's not an optimism. First, I think we ought to know that among great Reformed theologians there has been a major difference on this subject. The significance of that for all of us is that we approach it with a great deal of care. If you have people like Calvin and Edwards differing on something, you know full well this calls for close concern. But you mustn't allow your own personal preferences to incline you either toward Edwards or toward Calvin on this. Otherwise, you call no man father. It's the Word of God that has to control you. Usually when you have them together and so on, you have a good deal more confidence in the matter. But when you see them different, you watch it more thoroughly. But go ahead with your liking that bowling. Okay.
Okay. Hodge often says in this chapter that you are to avoid worldly amusement, as he calls it. But he never really developed. Now, I guess I'd call bowling worldly amusement. But he just gives that as a given. And he never really backs that up.
He doesn't specify that. You mean, is that what you mean? He doesn't say what he means?
Right. I mean, he doesn't even get into the question of being more lax on the Sabbath, of whether those amusements are allowed after a period of worship has been observed.
He would call that laxity, though, even though he doesn't use the word here. I'm a little surprised at some of the things he doesn't say in this chapter, as well as some of the things. You see, he was very much concerned with what comes up in the end of the chapter about the aliens and the Roman Catholics and others coming in who have a different kind of. So this is a Protestant country, you see, and this is the way we have traditionally observed the Sabbath. And while we don't require anybody to become Protestants, we don't require even to be Christians or anything like that, at the same time they've got to respect the fact that they are in a Protestant Christian country. And he goes so far as to say that if you work on Sunday, if you were required to work on Sunday and did so, you couldn't be a Christian. That's the implication. You couldn't elect. If you go to vote for somebody on Sunday, you see, leave a whole Christian franchise would be lost, you see, because no Christian could go vote on Sunday, according to him. It's something beside the purpose. Remember, the way in which he would be dealing with the question you're raising here, I would say, and he talks about these two basic principles, you know. Sabbath is meant for special religious worship, and the acts of mercy. Those are the two things, see, that you're supposed to do. Everything else goes by the board, especially secular work, and presumably, by implication, secular activity. Now, Edwards, too, avoids any specific dealing with whether a person can swim on Sunday or walk on Sunday or go hiking on Sunday or something like that. But the fundamental principles are there, and they think that you can draw. And you may be a little bit surprised in reading this chapter that there were so many people who developed the significance of the Sabbath commandment, not so much in terms of worship as the prohibition of regular employment, you know. 6 days shalt thou labor, not the seventh day. So that was to them all that was really permanently binding about the commandment, and that would apply to these workers, laborers, you see, that Hodge is referring to here, even if they weren't Christians. They'd have the benefit of being free from employment on the Sabbath day, and that would be good for their body, good for their mind, and everything else, and if they had a spiritual sensitivity for their soul as well, and all that. So the implication there is, with those two positive principles, that's the way you ought to occupy yourself on the Sabbath day.
But,
and it was in the Westminster Confession, too.
Yeah. But, now, how would Calvin answer that?
About...
How would he say, it's okay for me to go bowling? How would he...
Oh, he simply feels, and there's a little bit of difference in Calvin. He won't get into that, but one of my former students did a very able master's thesis in this area. But generally speaking, his positive principle is that the Sabbath, even though it's a part of the Decalogue, but nevertheless was oriented toward that ancient Jewish economy. And the only thing that was really abidingly authoritative about that commandment was the idea of special worship, and a day when the people of God gathered together, and you had the communion of saints, and you had the testimony to the world that you believed in God, and so on. That was the heart, as Calvin saw it, of the Sabbath commandment that continues permanently. All the other details. See, everybody agrees. Let's make sure we get this particular point here. Everybody agrees on the fact that there should be worship on the Sabbath. Every Christian, nobody denies that, as far as I ever know, at all. And works of mercy and necessity. That's understood. I mean, you have to have hospitals open on the Sabbath, you see. That type of thing has to be available. Christ will rescue an animal, you see, on the Sabbath day. You can't criticize him for that. That's an act of mercy, but there's also an act of necessity as well. Now, those two things you agree with about it. But you see, as far as Calvin was concerned, this was the heart of it. And all the special liturgy, all the double sacrifices, and all the meticulous details about picking up sticks and things of that character were tied in with that ancient economy, so that while this is a part of the Decalogue and therefore permanent moral legislation, that's one of the major arguments he gives, you know, when he talks about the continuity of it. That's one of the major arguments that anybody gives when he talks about the continuing authority of the Sabbath day. It is that fact that it's in the Decalogue. You don't repeal the commandment, thou shalt not kill. You don't repeal the commandment, thou shalt not have any other gods in my presence. And you don't repeal the commandment, honor your father and mother. And you don't repeal the commandment, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Calvin agrees with that. But what is the essence of that commandment extracted from these associated details of the Old Testament was a matter of worship. That is mandatory. And that was a regular stipulated church service in which he often expounded, though he was not a pastor, he was an expositor of the word. That was the morning service. So what he did with the rest of the day, that was entirely his doing. If the bowling was a way of diversion for him, with certain limitations of times and so on. The fact that he had already worshipped left him free to do that if he wanted to swim, if he wanted to hike, if he wanted to sleep, or whatever he wanted to do. That was entirely. That was not mandated by God. The worship service was mandated, and he would have been delinquent in his duty had he been absent from church inexcusably, and the same way with his people and so on. So you see, there was no problem because the Sabbath just extended to the worship period. That was mandatory. That was what part of the permanent decalogue. So much of these other things were connected. That's the heart of the problem, you see. How much of this, there were certain things. Sacrifices, for example, were part of the Sabbath. We don't do those now. They were clearly repealed, you see, and so on. Now, but the 24-hour period, is that something? Well, you see, Edwards would say 24 hours is set aside as the part of the time which should be taken away from your usual activity and given over primarily to the worship of God. He'd command all 7 if he wanted. He could take 6 days and leave you 1 day to work, whatever his pleasure would be, you see. But he has decided, God has decided, it was good for his creatures that 6 of their days should be given over to taking care of their needs and their society's needs and so on. 1 day out of the 7. Now, that was a fundamental principle. A 24-hour period can't be shifted to a 1-hour period satisfactorily just because that's the 1 hour or 2 hours in which you engage in worship. But Calvin was apparently not convinced of that. And Calvin just felt that was all there was to it, so whether he bowled or what he did on the rest of the Sabbath, as long as it was a legitimate activity in moderation and so on, he'd feel free to do.
On what basis then did Calvin feel like all the other aspects of the Sabbath were repealed? I mean, I understand like the repealing of sacrifices, and I think Hodge mentions the repealing of cities of sanctuary. And
Yeah.
that. On what basis then would Calvin and people who said that those other aspects of the Sabbath, the goodness of the Sabbath, was repealed?
Well, you see, something like sacrifice is clearly repealed because that's been fulfilled, right? And that's what we all agree on, you see, that God has specified it. If you're asking the question, how does he get down to the point of repealing, say, the 24-hour period, I don't think he does it logically, you understand, but his rationale is that what was essential to that and not temporary and so on was the matter of worship. And he felt as long as you worshiped, it didn't make much difference how much time was taken to that, but it had to be done on that day. And it had to be done together. And there had to be a witness of the church to the world in that particular area. But he just felt that the 24-hour aspect of it and so on was tied up with the sacrificial system. I feel stupid when I give this. I don't think it's a cogent argument, but nevertheless, that's the way he writes.
It just seems to me like as you look down the Ten Commandments, that the minutia of the Ten Commandments do seem to pass away, but that your heart,
Well, that's
the
what they...
emphasis on your heart, increase with Christ coming. So it would seem like the Sabbath would become more holy in a way.
Yeah, there should be more spirituality in it. No question. Calvin wouldn't deny that. He's believing that this should be true in spiritual worship, you understand, and so on. And that is absolutely mandatory. It's a part of the Decalogue and all. But as I say, when you try to say, there's no debate on the fact that the sacrifices are done away with. We all agree on that because God himself has abolished those. And so, well, did God implicitly abolish? He didn't explicitly abolish the 24-hour period. And Calvin is not saying you're getting away from the Sabbath. He still says, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. The way you keep it holy now is by public worship together and such things as that. But when you press him on the question, why would worship be restricted just to 1 hour in public worship? Why not, as the Westminster Confession of Faith says, which had a Puritan Sabbath, you understand? It represents a Puritan Sabbath, so you can say Presbyterianism has been Puritan on this point. Why would you say it would be restricted just to Sunday morning worship, say 11 o'clock hour or something like that? And why would it not be for the whole day? And if Christ justifies, even in the Jewish economy under which he operated, the doing of acts of mercy, the healing this man with a withered hand and so on, why would they not? They would be specifically permitted and so on. So how could you dare say that the 24-hour aspect is done away with? It is certainly not explicitly done away with. It doesn't seem to be implicitly done away with because God sees fit. Even he could have given double sacrifices without setting the whole 24-hour period aside, you see. But he didn't. So obviously it seemed to be necessary for us to have 1 day free from our secular responsibilities, except those which are absolutely necessary or involved in acts of mercy, which are devoted entirely to the meditation, the worship, and the service of God. Why? As I commented when I went through Calvin on the Ten Commandments several years ago here, he doesn't give any rationale. This is one of the things that's a little exasperating about Calvin, as I pointed out in the class on Monday morning sometimes. He doesn't dig in to things the way Edwards does. He spreads it out. His magnificent command of the Bible, his powerful rhetoric, and his pungent polemics and such things. Very, very impressive type of thing. But probing, the sort of thing you're getting here, is very hard to get in Calvin. It's easy in Edwards. It's easier in the Puritans. They generally tended to be, but Edwards and Calvin's incomparable in that other. That's all I can say that I've ever been able to find in him on that type of thing. May have been influenced by Luther, you see, on this point. Luther just, you remember I've used that expression before about the conservative Reformation. The Lutheran Reformation was more conservative of the medieval errors than the Reformation was there. And Luther went along with that pretty easily, as well as he went along with some other things which the Reformed people felt he should have removed as well, even though he was the giant by whom God opened up the whole Reformation era.
Recreation.
Well, remember he said, "Come apart," and to his disciples, they'd come apart now that he went fishing, for example, on the Sea of Galilee. It doesn't mention. One would never get the impression that he felt it was a sin. He'd get in the boat, with the men, and so when they go fishing, partly that was an occupation with them, but it was probably a diversion as well for him to get on there. But we don't know of any hobbies he had or anything like that. But on the other hand, you don't get the impression that he would be opposed to archery or bowling or whatever game like that. It's a wholesome game there. But he would get busy, and overwhelmed with work and crowd, and get in the boat and escape them, and not let them know where he's going, and be apart with his disciple, and you could see them sort of relaxing. You could feel each muscle rise up and stretch out and lie down, take it easy, and all that sort of thing. That kind of recreation they had. Recreation's a subjective term. What something's recreation for you wouldn't be work for me. Something a recreation for me would drive him up the wall and so on. And well, the way you do it, as long as it's a legitimate thing, something will be recreation for one person, not for another, and that type of thing. But we don't know. We do know that Jesus did withdraw from the crowds. He stopped preaching at times. He stopped healing, and he just got away with his disciples, with his intimate friends. He talked to them in ways he wouldn't talk to the crowd, and explain things that he said to the crowd to them. That's a kind of diversion. And he enjoyed, with desire have I desired to eat this meal with you. Before he was about to die, he got real pleasure just being in the presence, even though he was celebrating his crucifixion. But with desire have I desired, just to be in your company. That meant he clothed himself in humanity to redeem us. And that was his joy, just to be in the presence of his people. And so on. I don't know that he needed any other recreation, but he certainly would not have been opposed to it. Yeah.
Going on with this, later on in the book, but
Yeah. We don't have to stick to the page order.
the bottom of page 339,
All right.
just talking about Luke 14, and right down at the end, he says, the very bottom of the page, this was evidently a large entertainment to which death would be, talking about the parable, and this is the third
Mhm.
Christ therefore thought right in the prosecution of his work to attend on second appearance on the Sabbath.
A marriage. Yeah, that type of. Wasn't there some indication about Cana being? Maybe there wasn't. But no, here he's talking. This is just a story, as you say, about the. I get what you mean. This is evidently a large entertainment. Christ therefore thought right in the prosecution of his work, such entertainments on the Sabbath. Hodge is certainly assuming that this was a reference to the Sabbath day, because it was in the context of this dispute about the Sabbath day and so on. It doesn't seem like a reasonable conjecture on your part there.
Well, I guess I was curious about
What he meant by legitimate entertainment on the Sabbath. Yeah.
Back to the bowling.
Yeah, but to see a wedding, for example, we know he went to weddings and so on, and I don't know that we know they were on Sabbath there. Generally speaking, the Puritans would not approve of a wedding on the Sabbath day. The funeral, things like that, they would put on another day there. It's hold as strictly as possible to this type of thing. But Entertainment. Now, as you say, Hodge isn't saying what he means by this entertainment, and he broadens it out to attain, he uses that expression, tend on such entertainments, what it would be. But it does seem to suggest that Hodge would not think having a wedding or attending a wedding or performing a wedding and so on would be out of order on the Sabbath day. He would not be as strict as the Puritans on a matter like that. Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry. He probably has dealt with that in his book on church polity. I mean, if we had time to get through the Hodge bibliography, you know, we could probably find more specific references, but I don't remember them offhand on that. Yes, sir.
But on our, what we call recreation, often causes other people to actually work.
But you see, as far as Calvin is concerned, he would not mind either. Yeah, he wouldn't mind, as far as Calvin is concerned, he wouldn't mind his setting up the pins for you while you bowled, you see, because that was not, the Sabbath had already been kept, you see, by public worship. We had this great historical struggle in England with King James I, you know, who had come down from Scotland, and the Puritans had hoped for better things, you know, than they had had under Elizabeth and all. But when he issued that book of sports of his, of course, that drove the Puritans up the wall, because that justified all this type of thing as long as they attended the Anglican Church service, you know, at the proper time. Then they could have their fairs and everything else on the Sabbath day, play their games and have their Super Bowls and all the rest of the thing. I'm not punning on the bowling here, but I mean, any kind of entertainment that appealed to them, which the Puritans, on the other hand, were very insistent on the opposite. But once you take this other view, you see, if the Sabbath commandment is met by public worship, then whether you play or work or any other time, you just have to determine that on the basis of its legitimacy and your time and money and all that type of thing. Bob is just trying to get a word in edgewise, I think.
I'm over my quota for questions.
Go ahead, Bobby. Go ahead.
Throughout all this discussion of observance of the Sabbath, they frequently say, okay, under the old dispensation we did one thing, now that's changed in some particulars, and we disagree sometimes as to what particulars, but it seems to me when I look at the old dispensation, and you see, okay, the commandment is 1 day out of 7, and then you look at other rules that they had, such as you couldn't have a bondservant for more than 7 years. Every 7th year, other special things came into effect. Twice that time was a jubilee when even more obligations were released and so forth under the law. Now, apparently that all passed away with the old dispensation. And nobody has ever commented on the similarity between those, or the harmony between those under the old dispensation, have they?
Oh, yes, they've written about that, and they had a big conference in Pittsburgh, say, about 5 years ago, a Jubilee Conference, a 50-year celebration, and the fundamental principles that still apply. Even the theonomists, you know, who believe that everything in the Old Testament, which has not been explicitly terminated, is obligatory. And when Bahnsen is writing on that subject, for example, he talks about the rule that they had in the Old Testament that you must not build a fence, you know, around the top of your and you must build a fence around the top of your flat roof and so on. And he mentions by the principle of equity, which he feels in the Westminster Confession, what you have to do is see to it that you protect the trespassers on your particular property, you see. And the equivalent of that today, since we don't build flat roofs anymore, it would be absolutely absurd to protect people from walking on a flat roof which doesn't exist, except in the Holiday Inn on 57th Street in New York City. We took our dog up there. They had a parapet around there, too. They didn't have fence with that parapet. And so, but since we usually have our, you know, slanting roofs and all that type of thing, the principle now is that when you build that swimming pool in your backyard, you've got to have surround, because otherwise somebody walking through could either fall in the cement or fall in the water and drown. That's the principle. That's the way the Old Testament is applied. The fundamental principle of equity, concern for the opposite person. That's the way you express it in that time of that particular economy. This is the way you express it at our particular time. And that's an area. That's Bahnsen as a thoroughgoing theonomist. But that's an area where we'd all close ranks with him and agree with him. There's no rule in the Bible which says thou shalt put a protection around your backyard swimming pool. But in principle, it's there. I mean, you have no right in the back of your yard, Bob, to have something that if I happened to be visiting you and walked out there and so on and didn't know it, and I fell in the 9-foot end of your, right into the cement and so on, you as a lawyer know full well I could sue you for that sort of thing. I wouldn't do it, but I would certainly reprimand you sharply for doing that. That to be on a moral ground. You know.
Well, my observation, though, was that really the obverse of that is an argument for the lessening of the requirement for observation of the Sabbath. Because so many of these other things have passed away or been radically reduced in the new dispensation.
Well, this sort of thing, as I say about the fence around the roof, that would carry on in the sense of equity. And you mentioned the cities of refuge, you see. And Hodge, somewhere or other, I think it's in this chapter, but somewhere or other, he mentions the matter of laws of divorce, you know, and the laws of adultery, execution, and such as things as that, he maintains have been changed in the New Testament. Once they have been changed, that's settled. That God makes the laws. God is the only one who can actually change them. And some he has, but he's never changed the idea of a 24-hour period. He's never changed the emphasis on worship. And while certainly mercy would have been implicit in the Old Testament, still it was explicit in Jesus Christ as well. So that's what you're working in. It's perfectly true, something. So you sit open to the fact. If somebody comes up with what's to you a surprising idea, you won't be shocked by it. You say, well, all right, now what's the evidence there that God has actually repealed it? It's repealable by God. He has repealed other things. But we'd have to be holding back on the fact that he's the only one who could do it. And if he hasn't done it, we don't dare do it. So I don't think there's any problem there. Do you want anybody want another question before we take our break? If not, let's see where we take up. We've been ranging through. I think most of you have read the chapter, and we've been ranging through various parts of it. I guess we'll continue the same way, because this is one of those chapters of his where he is not so heavy and ponderous as he usually is, but he covers a subject, and we'll just see where we want to go with it when we come back. So we might as well take a break now if nobody has a question at the moment.